Great. Well, hello everyone. Welcome back to 2020 Small Farms Winter Webinar Series hosted by University of Illinois Extension, Local Food Systems and Small Farms team. It's Grant McCarty, a local foods and small farms educator in the Rockford area, and I'll be your moderator today. We appreciate you joining us for these webinars. We'll do our best to begin and end within the space of your lunch hour. We recognize this is a pretty tight time frame for our educators to deliver in-depth, actionable information. So please understand why we are limiting your questions to the question and answer box during the presentation. I'll do my best to make sure our presenters answer them as time allows. This presentation is being recorded. Zach will email a link to the archived presentation as soon as possible after this concludes. There will also be a link for a very short online evaluation of this presentation included in that email, and we very much appreciate your feedback. We'll also try to start sharing a screenshot of the QR code at the end that links to the survey at the end of each webinar, so you can use a smartphone camera to scan the QR code and take you directly to the evaluation. We're using Zoom's webinar platform this year, so there are a few additional features to point out for those that are unfamiliar. There is a poll that you should be able to click on in your webinar toolbar. There you will find a voluntary anonymous demographic form that will be very helpful for us in Extension. At the same time, you also see a question and answer section and a chat box. Q&A section is for questions that you have for the presenter. We can also ask the presenter at the end or the moderator may be able to answer if possible. The chat box can be used for all other technical questions related to the webinar, sound issues, other technical problems you may have as well. This week's presentation from Phil Alberti. Phil Alberti is a commercial agriculture extension educator with the University of Illinois Extension. He works in commercial crop production, assisting growers and producers by providing resources for row crop production in Joe Davis, Stevenson, and Winnebago counties. His area of expertise includes soil fertility, corn and soybean management practices, cover crops, and no-till systems. Originally from southeastern Wisconsin, Phil received a bachelor's degree in molecular biology and botany from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in 2015, and a master's of science in plant sciences from South Dakota State in 2017. Since 2018, Phil has been working in hemp production outreach and research on both a local level and a statewide focus. He brings with him a wealth of information on this new crop and assisting growers in getting started and helping to bring this crop forward. With that, I'm going to pass it on to you, Phil, to get us going.
Thank you very much, Grant, and welcome everybody. I'm very glad to be here. As Grant said, my name is Phillip Alberti, and I primarily serve Northwestern Illinois up here in Freeport, but regarding industrial hemp programming, I go pretty much everywhere. So today, we're going to talk about updates on industrial hemp in Illinois, and I'm going to warn you ahead of time, we have a lot of stuff we're going to cover here, and we're going to move through it quickly, hopefully to give you as much time for questions at the end of the webinar. So let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about things like taxonomy and morphology, the cannabinoid profile, production systems and considerations. We're going to touch very, very briefly on grain and fiber, but primarily on CBD production. We're going to discuss the rules and regulations, both the USDA and the Illinois state rules. And we're going to talk about harvest and compliance testing, which I think is the most important part of this presentation. And I really hope you take some good information away with you. And lastly, we're going to end up with some resources that are available both regionally and in the state of Illinois. With that being said, I would like to make it known that there is not any research currently done at the University of Illinois, although we do have plans for it for 2020. So a lot of the resources and information I'm providing to you is coming from other land-grant universities, places like Kentucky, Penn State, Oregon State, Colorado State, Vermont, Tennessee, Wisconsin, etc. So we're just trying to compile all this research and put it into a place where you can get a good baseline on this information. So let's get into it. The first thing I'd like to talk about is what is the hemp plant. It is the cannabis plant. We know that it is primarily dioecious, meaning that there is mostly going to be plants, separate male and female plants. Hemp is a photoperiod dependent crop similar to soybeans in that it is triggered flowering by day length. And lastly, when we talk about the cannabis plant, the differences between hemp and marijuana are purely the amount of THC that is in the plant. So if it's above the 0.3% THC mark, it's considered marijuana, and if it's below that, it's considered hemp. However, there has been a lot of discussion regarding the terminology and what THC we are discussing. I would like to point out that the state of Illinois, denoted by the IDOA, will be discussing Delta-9 THC for the 2020 growing season, whereas the rest of the country will follow the USDA rules and be looking at total THC. But for the most of this presentation, unless it's discussed, or at least I draw attention to it, we will be discussing the Illinois rules of Delta-9 THC. I would just like to point out that although we are categorizing hemp and marijuana solely on the amount of THC in the plant, that there are other species of the cannabis plant, Cannabis indica, Cannabis sativa, and Cannabis ruderalis, and each one of those, can be considered industrial hemp or marijuana based on the amount of THC concentration in the plant. Just wanted to point that out. So when we talk about industrial hemp, I know that the hot topic is the CBD production, which is found in the flowers, but hemp can be grown for seed, it can be grown for fiber, as well as the flower. And we're going to talk a little bit about each one of those production practices, just to give you an understanding of where the industry might go and the different types of hemp that are available for production. So when we talk about the end products, we have to also discuss the production systems for each of those products. They're going to be different depending on what your end use is for the industrial hemp, whether you're growing it for fiber, grain, or CBD. Each one of them has their own production systems, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before we do, I like to make little analogies here when discussing hemp production because they are quite different. So when we're talking about growing hemp for fiber, we think of it much more like a hay production system or forages, where we are growing this plant, allowing it to accumulate biomass, and then we're going to chop that down and bale it for fiber processing. Grain is much more like a small grains, or example would be a wheat production system, where we are allowing the plant to grow, to pollinate, to set seed, and then we are going to harvest that seed head at the end of the growing season. And lastly, we have our CBD production systems, which represent much more like a specialty crop operation than fiber and grain, which are more similar to our traditional row crop production here in the state of Illinois. So when we grow hemp for fiber, we are talking about the growth of the fiber plant, or sorry, the hemp plant for the bast fiber, which is extremely valuable for textiles, composites, and paper, as well as the woody core, or the hurd, which can also be used in building materials and other agricultural products. And so the problem is, right now there is no market and no processing for hemp fiber in the state of Illinois to separate the bast fiber from the hurd in a process called decortication. There is no processing currently in the state, and which is where a kind of a bottleneck for production is at currently. But a fiber production system, as I said, is much more similar to a hay production system, where we're going to be planting using direct seeding, using a grain drill broadcaster at very high seeding rates. We are going to chop that material, and then we are going to bale it at the end of the season for processing. Okay, but notice we're talking about seeding rates in the excess of 50 pounds per acre. And the industrial hemp plant can have as many as 30,000 seeds per pound. So at a very high density. As you'll see from the picture on the top right, that is some very high density population hemp, which was grown in Canada for fiber production. It was then chopped and then baled and sent off for processing. The grain hemp can be grown like it sounds, for the grain, right? So we grow the plant, it pollinates, it sets seed, and then the grain can be then harvested. It is used and cold pressed into things like hemp seed oil, and you can also find it at the health food section of your local store as a food additive or a high protein seed or nut. The interesting thing about grain hemp is that you can currently eat it yourselves and you can feed it to your children, but you cannot feed it to animals for human consumption. There's a lot of interest in that, as that is being done in other areas of the world, but currently not allowed in the United States. So just keep that in mind. I would like to point out too that there is also a big distinction between hemp seed oil and CBD oil. So hemp seed oil, as you can see in the picture here, comes from the crushed and processed hemp seeds, whereas CBD oil is extracted from the flowers of the cannabis plant. So very similar to the fiber production, grain hemp would be used direct seeding using some type of grain drill or a broadcaster, but at a much lower seeding rate. And then it will be harvested using a combine, and the grain is then sent to the bins or to be dried. I wanted to point out the difference here between these production systems, also to note that when we're talking about grain and fiber production, it's much more similar to our row crop production. And as we move into the CBD production side of things, you're going to see that it's quite a bit different of a system to grow CBD hemp. So CBD hemp, as I said before, it looks much more like a specialty crop operation. Row spacing, we're typically going to be using transplants in a CBD hemp operation, but as we've seen this year, some growers have elected to use direct seeding and have been quite effective at it, but we have seen most of the growers this year ended up using transplants in the state of Illinois. Your target population for CBD hemp, as you'll see here, is roughly going to be between 1,000 and 2,000 female plants per acre, which is substantially different than when we're seeding at, say, 25 or 30 pounds per acre for a grain crop. But you will also note that the morphology in the CBD hemp plant is much more branched. Cannabis plant likes to take up the space of the container that it's in. So if you give it more space, it'll produce more branching and will become more of a bushy looking plant. Harvest of CBD hemp ranges from hand and machine harvest depending on the end use, whether that's going to be for high quality smokable flower or for extraction via biomass. And we can talk more about that a little bit later. And lastly, for post-harvest, it's very important to get this crop down to about 10% moisture for storage. And it can be either dried and cured and trimmed for the high quality smokable flower, or it can be chopped using silage choppers, forage choppers, and stored for extraction, ethanol extraction. And this is what we like to term as biomass, the whole plant biomass. All right, so why the value of the market right now is so interested currently in CBD hemp is for these cannabinoids. So cannabis contains at least 85 types of cannabinoids, including CBD, the non-intoxicating cannabinoid, and THC, which is the intoxicating compound found in the cannabis plant. Importantly, CBD is found within the oil and resin glands of the trichomes, which are the crystalline structures that are appearing on the flower, as you can see in the picture here. But it's produced in the unpollinated flowers and not in the seeds, which is a very important distinction. So in a CBD production system, males must be culled because we do not want the female flowers to be pollinated and set seed, which will effectively halt all cannabinoid production. CBD is psychoactive but not intoxicating. And for those of you who are interested in how value is associated with a CBD hemp crop, it is typically assigned in dollars per percent CBD per pound. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later as well. For some of you specialty growers out there who are more interested in higher quality smokable flower, this is something that has been kind of popping up in conversations lately with some of the growers who are looking at not just the cannabinoids such as THC, CBD, CBG, and the others, but also the flavor and taste compounds that are associated with each individual cannabis plant. So if we were to take a look at some of the terpenes, which are the smell compounds, and the flavonoids, which give them this taste, there is a specialty market going to be developing, or I'm sorry, this is currently kind of developing for these essential oils and other products that are produced by the cannabis plant, not just the cannabinoids themselves. So for example, terpenes like limonene, which give the plant material a citrusy smell, or something like pinene, which gives us a very piney smell. These are qualities that are being looked at the high-end smokable flower market, and it's just something I wanted to bring to folks' attention. So in 2018, the Industrial Hemp Act was passed in the state of Illinois, and there was a tremendous interest in the amount of production in the state. We had over 900 grower applications for 20,000 acres, and north of 95% of those applications would be for CBD hemp production. We had some growers across the state experimenting with grain and fiber, but a primary interest was in the CBD production. There are areas within the state which have higher concentrations of production, such as the Peoria area, South Chicago, and Northern Illinois, which borders Wisconsin, who also had industrial hemp production in 2018 and 2019. So a lot of interest across the state. What I would like to talk about is some just general considerations when growing industrial hemp. Primarily the planting depth. This is a very shallow seeded crop. As you can see from the picture here, they're very small seeds, and so they have poor seedling vigor to emerge through a soil. So keep that in mind if you are looking to direct seed. Very shallow seeding, it does not handle soil crusting very well. And if I had to choose a particular soil type that hemp would prefer, it's well-drained soil, something like a sandy loam or a silty loam, but something that's well-drained. Hemp does not like wet feet, although it will take up plenty of water throughout the growing season. It just does not like standing in it. So when considering where to plant this hemp crop, I like to put a particular emphasis on three things. One, it's got to be a highly productive ground. This isn't the legacy hemp from the fiber during the World War II days. This is a different hemp altogether entirely when producing it for CBD, and you have to put it on your productive grounds to have a productive crop. And the reason for that is twofold. The first of which is fields that have low weed pressure are going to be very important because there are no herbicides that are labeled for industrial hemp production. And so keeping a clean seed bed during planting and after planting during the early growth stages are very critical for the hemp crop. And also well-drained soils. When soils are saturated, the hemp crop does not grow very well, the cannabis plant does not grow well, and weeds can outcompete early on in the season. And without those alternative weed control options, aside from cultural practices, it's going to be very difficult to control weeds once they kind of get out of control. So planting rate and method, as I discussed earlier, will depend on the type of production system you are looking for. I get a lot of questions about considerations regarding fertility for the hemp crop, and to be frank, we just don't have many good studies out there regarding CBD hemp production, and so most of our fertility recommendations are exclusively for grain and fiber, and these are actually numbers that came out of the University of Kentucky from Dr. David Williams, who was a pioneer in hemp research there for several years. But these are the recommendations for grain and fiber. However, we are concerned with sharing recommendations for CBD production as we do not know what fertility regimens may have an impact on in terms of cannabinoid production. So our fear might be that increasing seeding rates successively may alter THC concentration, which would make a crop non-compliant and essentially could be a complete loss. So as of right now, there are no fertility recommendations out there for CBD production, and we just want to make folks aware of our concerns there. Regardless, though, we can make some statements about growth stages of the cannabis plant in general. It likes to germinate and emerge quite quickly, especially if we are planting into warm, well-drained soils that have adequate moisture. But what will happen is after the plant emerges, it will go through this slow growth stage, which is the first portion of the vegetative growth stage. And essentially what we see is that the cannabis crop likes to develop root systems below ground and kind of halts its above ground biomass, at least temporarily, or grows slowly. And this is where that critical growth stage for weed control is, because we want to make sure we allow the cannabis plant to get out of that slow growth stage, develop its root systems, and then be able to shoot up during the rapid growth stage and really take on that above ground biomass. Keeping in mind, this is like soybeans, so it's based off of photoperiod. The earlier you plant it, the more biomass you will likely obtain prior to flowering. But we just like to keep the focus on this being a photoperiod dependent crop. And I would like to stress that the advantage of this is that you will likely be able to get a crop seeded later into the season and still have it begin flowering when you would like it to, but take patience and really consider the planting conditions when you want to get this crop established. because you will likely have additional time into June, potentially even early July, to get this transplants or seeded into the ground and get a successful crop potentially. Just note that photoperiod will initiate flowering at roughly the same time, regardless of when it's planted. So after we go for the slow growth stage, we move into the rapid growth stage, and these plants will really grow quickly. The research suggests 1 to 3 inches per day, and they, as I've seen this growing season, they grow quite quickly. I'm sorry. I would like to just illustrate the growth of the root systems of the cannabis plant. It does develop a nice taproot along with some fibrous roots. And later on in the growing season, when these plants are fully established and mature, that these root systems are well developed, well established, and also the base of the stalk at the soil line can be extremely thick and robust. So after we go from the vegetative growth stage, we move into the reproductive phase, where plants, both male and female plants, will begin to express their sex and will be able to determine if a plant is a male or female plant. In the state of Illinois, this happened depending on where you are, from the first week of August into the second and potentially third week of August, depending on where you were in the state of Illinois and also which cultivars were planted or varieties were planted. But ultimately, harvesting of this plant happened in late September or early October. I just want to point out the differences between the male and the female plant. We can see on the male that there are these pollen sacs and these clusters they look almost like grape clusters where the pollen is going to be stored. It will then, the pollen sacs will burst, spreading the pollen and then pollinate the female plant. However, in a CBD production system, we do not want any males, as this will halt CBD production and set grain. So in a CBD production system, as soon as males are identified, you will want to cull them from the field. So right after flowering has been initiated, this is when we see THC accumulation and CBD accumulation. Basically, all cannabinoid production will be increasing after flowering. So in this particular diagram here from Rock River Laboratories, we see that around the first or second week of August, flowering was initiated. And from that point on, throughout the growing season, cannabinoids were increasing in concentration all the way through maturity. And the goal here is that we wish to limit the total amount of THC produced to below that 0.3% threshold while maximizing the CBD or other cannabinoids production that we are looking for. So again, CBD, CBG, or CBN, for example. But that 0.3% threshold is really where we want to keep it from going over. Some general observations from pest diseases, diseases and insects. European corn borer, corn earworm, and Eurasian hemp borer are three of the bigger insects I would be looking for this coming growing season. We saw that if it liked corn, it seemed to like hemp quite a bit. We'll talk a little bit more about the Eurasian hemp borer later, but these are three of the bigger ones I'd like you to be on the lookout for in your fields if you're going to be growing industrial hemp. Spider mites, aphids, and whiteflies are more of an indoor production concern, but there's something that we will be looking out for as well. And then regarding diseases, white mold and gray mold, gray mold botrytis are two of the biggest concerns, especially up in the northern part of Illinois, as we have a plant that is flowering for 6 to 8 weeks, and which is a prime conditions for these pathogens to invade the floral structures and also open it up to other diseases. So white mold and gray mold are two of our bigger floral pathogens that we are concerned with. So again, CBD hemp, we're talking about planting from seeds and or transplants, depending on the equipment that you have. And we're looking between 1,000 and 2,000 female plants per acre. This might be a good time to discuss the difference between our conventional seed, which is available, where you can buy seed that contains 50% males to 50% females, just noting that you will have to cull half of those plants when they begin flowering. But you can also purchase what's called feminized seed, which if done correctly contain north of 99% females, and will still need to be scouted, and is more of expensive seed, but might be something for you to consider. So conventional versus feminized seed would be another thing to consider. So here's just some pictures throughout the course of the growing season. Here's a picture from American Hemp Research out of Roseville. This is their transplanter. They actually use several methods this season. They use plasticulture and transplanted. They also use direct seeding into plasticulture. And so this is just a typical specialty crop vegetable planter that we used, or sorry, excuse me, that they used to transplant their hemp crop. Direct seeding also happened, and we had good experiences with it. We also had some poor experiences with it. Here's actually just a compare and contrast picture showing two separate fields, which were both direct seeded using that thin, clear plastic and direct seeded in. The picture on the left had good emergence. The picture on the right did not. So this is just kind of to illustrate to you that what's going on right now, where there's really no best way to establish the hemp crop. We don't have recommendations on transplants versus direct seeding and seeding rates and things like that. It's all just kind of whatever folks are out there using to make it work. And so we've seen direct seeding work, and we've seen it not work as well. So just something to keep in mind, and noting that the seed costs for industrial hemp and CBD hemp are extremely high. And so it's just something you're going to want to really consider when making your decisions. I'd like to point out here, so the CBD hemp, it grows much more like a vegetable crop, or with the branching that it has. And so it takes up the space of the container. Here we can see some lateral branching occur. And what I want to point out here is that around July 23rd up here in Freeport, I was getting a lot of calls regarding this little floral structure that was popping up at the branch, at the nodes. And this was what many folks thought to be the first set of flowers, or the flower identification stage. And really these leafy structures that are developing are kind of called pre-flowers, and they are just indications that the plant will soon be flowering. It's kind of just a little indicator that you're going to have to get out there pretty soon to start scouting for males and females. Just some pictures here to show throughout the growing season the differences here. You can see that even in just a short amount of time, how fast these plants are going to grow once they get well established. The picture to the left was actually just a small family farm who grew only about a ½ acre, and they transplanted all of these by hand. They used a inter-row cultivator, essentially some type of rototill, to keep the alleys clear of weeds during the early stages of the growth season. The picture on the right, this is just a really nice picture from a system, a plasticulture system, row spacing and ranged across the state, but the pictures on both the left and the right are about at between 3 and 4 foot row spacing. And even at that row spacing, you can see how the canopy is going to be closing quickly, which is going to be very important during sex identification and calling of the males. So right around now, August 21st, this is up by me again in Freeport here, we begin to see the flowering occur. So the picture on the left is the female. Those are the female pollen receptors, the stigmas, which are starting to show, whereas the picture on the right shows what the males look like. And so at each one of these nodes, you can see where there are these little clusters of pollen sacs. You're going to want to get these out of the field as soon as you can, because these are what's going to, again, spread the pollen. They're going to pollinate the female plants, which are going to set seed, creating seed, and will also decrease the amount of, or limit the amount of CBD production in your field. So right around this time, again, we have these cannabinoids, which are starting to be produced at flowering. We want to limit our THC below 0.3% while maximizing the CBD. That is an error, that's my fault. By maximizing CBD. So over the course of the flowering period, what we are going to see is we're going to see these buds here on the left are going to be thickening, they're going to be enlarging, because essentially what we are doing is we are taking a situation where the female plants are trying to get pollinated to pass their genes on to the next generation, but we are depriving them of their ability to be pollinated. And so what they do is they increase in size and density in an attempt to attract that male pollen and reproduce. And so we are frustrating the plant, and it's producing larger flowers, larger stigmas in response to this deprivation. And you'll notice that each one of the nodes, these floral structures are developing. So here's something I'd like to point to your attention as well. The picture on the left was actually a very healthy female plant, which was in flowering, and we had a storm that came through, and the plant was damaged. Well, a few days later, that very plant started healing over, and what it started to do was produce male pollen sacs. And via a stress response, it started to produce male floral structures and became what was known as a hermaphrodite. And so my point of this is that it's really interesting to see what happens to plants when we're kind of, we're changing up what they want to do. By depriving them of their ability to pollinate, stress responses may encourage them to change their sex in an effort to reproduce. So even late in the season, after scouting these plants and culling the males, this is something you're still going to have to be watching out for to ensure that you don't get any rogue males that pollinate your hemp crop. The picture on the right is just showing to illustrate current seed selection right now is very limited, and because of that, there's a lot of poor seed quality out there. This isn't going to be, the fields that are planted or transplanted have not been uniform. We're seeing a lot of genetic segregation, mutations, diseases, things of that nature, and so I just want folks to be aware of that as well, making sure to discuss this with your a trustworthy seed dealer prior to making purchases. So as these plants have started flowering, only 3 to 4 weeks prior to this photo being taken in September here, we see these floral structures are developing very fast. This is actually a CRP field, a Conservation Reserve Program field, which was converted into production after years of being untouched. And so this is essentially an organic field where they strip tilled and transplanted the cannabis plants into the field and then use mowing as their weed control. This is actually a field of clover and grass, and they just planted these at a diagonal at about 4-foot centers and were able to go through with a riding mower to clear the alleys. But we're nearing maturity here as we end towards September. Here's another photo just showing the tremendous diversity of these plants within the same seed stock. We're seeing this happen all across the state. This is much more equivalent to 1920s, 1930s corn than it is to the hybrids we have today. And because of that, we are seeing a lot of genetic instability in the seeds that are being planted. As I discussed earlier, some of the insect pests I really wanted to emphasize, one being the Eurasian hemp borer. So walking through, you'll see this degradation of plant material, this withering of leaves, and if you go in and you expose, just kind of peel back the tissue, what you'll do is you'll expose this little larvae. This is, in fact, the Eurasian hemp borer. It's been something that's actually been around for a long time, kind of surviving most likely in our feral populations, but it's back, and it was a huge concern this year. Keeping in mind we didn't have any insecticides, pesticides, we just kind of had to sit back and take note of what these insects were doing. But basically what they do is they burrow into the floral structures and they invade the tissue, opening them up to other pathogens, especially things like gray mold and white mold later on in the season. White mold, we're no stranger to it in these parts here. White mold also invades soybean. It invades many other vegetable crops as well, but it's a potential concern here in Illinois for hemp production. It produces the microsporotia and fungal mycelium typical of the white mold, and we want to make sure that folks are aware of this, especially if they're considering planting into fields with a history of white mold, it's not something that would typically be recommended with planting the cannabis plant. But the same things occur. We have this invasion of the floral tissue as well as the stalk and stem, and it basically makes these plants useless and really decreases the production. So this is something we really want growers to be aware of. Okay, so now we're moving into towards the end of the season here. This is actually September 30th. We're considering harvest. I want to point out to everybody that you are not allowed to transport or harvest this crop without having a certificate of analysis from a state-approved laboratory stating that the material passes and is compliant and tests below that 0.3% delta 9 THC. Okay, we're going to talk more about certificates of analysis shortly here, but I want you all to understand that unless you have this material assessed by a laboratory prior to harvest, you cannot get it out of the field. So hemp harvest ranged from either hand harvest, selectively harvesting from smokable flower, in this case using chainsaws to get the base of the plant cut. They would remove the plants, take them in for storage and drying, and then for proper manicuring, trimming, etc., to turn this stuff into higher quality smokable flower. I'd like to point out as well that when these whole plants are being removed, they're going to be at about 70% moisture out in the field. And so you're going to be bringing them in to dry, but you're going to want to get them down to about 10% moisture for storage as well as for end-use processing. So conditions in October in Illinois aren't typically conducive for drying down plant material that far. So in many cases, commercial dehumidifiers and fans were rented and brought in for these sheds to get these plants down to their moisture level. I will also say that kind of the industry standard right now across the state has been 10% moisture and 10% CBD for the biomass. That's kind of what they're looking for. It's like a 10-10 rule kind of going on right now, so keep that in mind. But a lot of moisture you're going to have to get out at a time when drying down is not typically conducive. Just some pictures here of how these materials being dried. There are other ways to get this biomass into a form for the processors. You can use forage choppers or silage choppers, something like that, to get this material chopped down into biomass. Or you can do it the old-fashioned way, which is through bucking or shucking the plants and then trimming for smokable flower. Here's just a video to kind of show some of the mechanical harvesting methods that are being used across the state, where the plants were cut and left to dry in the field for a few days before going through with a rotary head. So I wanted to show the difference between those two harvest strategies, because it's really what the end product and the end use is going to be is going to determine how you get it out of the field. As I said before, smokable flower or biomass, how you treat it is ultimately going to depend on what the extraction method is or how it's going to be sold at the next level. So here's just another picture of another grower from American Hemp Research out in Roseville doing a very similar production practice of harvesting these plants using grain carts to dry down the material and then storing them into super sacks, as you can see on the right. So there's a lot of different ways to store the material. You can do it through fiber drums, polyurethane bags, or super sacks. However, if using the bagging method, you're going to want to get this material down to a little bit lower of a moisture, as condensation might be an issue with some of the biomass. So CBD extraction, this is where we're discussing where the plant material is going to go. If it's not going to be used for smokable flower, if it's going to be used for CBD oil, distillate, isolate, crude oil, that type of stuff, we're going to have to go through an extraction process. In essence, what we're doing, we're taking the molecules of interest and separating them from the biomass using some type of solvent, in most cases ethanol, to get a plant material extract. We are then able to heat that material up, heat up that alcohol for it to distill off, and then we are left with this crude oil, as you can see in the picture here, which can then be further processed in distillate and then also into isolate. What I would like folks to know is kind of what's happening right now in many cases is it's not atypical. You just bring in biomass and get it dropped off and get a check cut out for your product. In many cases, what these extractors and processors are going to want to do is take that material, extract it into a crude oil, and then hold on to it until they get calls for secondary processing, such as distillation or isolation, or distillates and isolates, and then they will call you and ask if you are comfortable with the sale of your product. So it's a little bit different of a system in many cases, and I want folks to be aware of kind of what's happening in the market right now that is different than many of the other products that we grow here in the state of Illinois. So moving into rules and regulations and harvesting compliance, I would like to just point out that no person can cultivate or process hemp in the state without a license, and that all licensed persons in the state must provide research information, which we will discuss shortly. All seeds and clones that you grow must have a certificate of analysis, which show that it tests below that 0.3% THC threshold. And then licenses and registrations cannot be transferred or assigned to somebody. So essentially, if you have a license, you cannot transfer it. They will, the other individual will have to get a separate license themselves. Minimum land area for cultivation is about a quarter of an acre for outdoor cultivation and 500 square feet for an indoor cultivation facility. Each indoor and outdoor cultivation facility will require their own separate license. And the information for these licenses shall be shared with law enforcement. And that's the only group of folks that should be getting your information will be law enforcement, which is actually for your benefit to ensure that they don't go destroying crops that they may confuse with marijuana. Any violations by a licensee or registrant may be subject to administrative action. So how do you get an application in the state of Illinois? Well, the first of which is you have to apply through the Department of Agriculture. And provided you pass their background check stating that you do not have a felony, drug-related misdemeanor, or crime of dishonesty, you will be able to get the approved for hemp production. When you apply, you're going to have to list the varieties and acreage to be planted along with your certificate of analysis, and any changes to the department's cultivation plan must be approved by the department. What that means is if for some reason you change where you're going to be planting the hemp this year, or you change the variety that you'd like to grow, that's all fine. You just have to make sure you let the IDOA know that that's what your intention is. Real quickly here over the cultivation and application, it's very simple. We just need your name, your address, where you're going to be growing the hemp in the form of GPS coordinates and a Google image. And then the application fee for hemp is $100 with the registration fee based on the amount of years you would like to cultivate hemp, ranging from 1 up to 3 years at a time. The processing license is also very similar, that in terms of the $100 application fee and that registration fees are going to be based on the number of years that you are producing or processing the industrial hemp. I would like to point out that if you are extracting the material, if you are trimming and curing the material, or if you are packaging, you are considered a processor and will need a processor's license. If you are growing industrial hemp, you will also, after planting, provide a pre-harvest report, which alerts the Department of Agriculture that you will be harvesting your crop. You have to give them at least 30 days prior to harvest to allow them the opportunity to come out and select your hemp for compliance testing. If for some reason, weather or inability to get into the field, something like that, if your harvest date is going to change in excess of 5 days, that's okay. You just have to let the Department of Agriculture know. And then at the end of the season, a final report, no later than February 1st of each year, you have to report the variety that was grown, planted and harvested acreage, as well as a appropriate measurements such as tonnage and seeds per acre, biomass in pounds per acre, or any other measurement approved by the Department of Agriculture. Regarding inspection and sampling, all licensees are subject to the inspection at the discretion of the Department of Agriculture. You may not be selected to be tested, but you will still be responsible to get your material tested and approved prior to harvest, even if you are not chosen by the Department of Agriculture. In essence, all plants are subject to sampling and testing to verify that Delta-9 THC concentration does not exceed 0.3%. And if it's below that, you are okay. You have a viable crop that can be harvested. If not, you are considered a hot or non-compliant crop and will have to be destroyed. As I said before, you cannot harvest the material until you have received a certificate of analysis, and transportation from a processing facility is also not allowed unless a certificate of analysis has been obtained. I would like to point out the 4 state-approved laboratories, ACT Laboratories, LK Pure Labs, Advanced Herbal Analytics, and Grace Analytical Laboratory. Those are the 4 state-approved laboratories where you can send in your material to get tests for cannabinoids and to ensure that you are testing compliant. All of those are available on the Department of Ag website, as well as the University of Illinois Hemp webpage as well. So moving on here to the compliance testing, this is very important. I'd like to point out that when we discussed earlier talking about the differences between Delta-9 THC and THCA at the federal and state rules, I want to now talk about why it's so important. So if we were to take a cannabis plant or a cannabis flower, bud, whatever you want to call it, from the field, it contains 2 types of THC. It has the Delta-9 THC, which is the active and intoxicating form, and it also has THCA, which is an inactive form. Okay, so inactive form and an active form. The federal rules and regulations require that any testing of the hemp plant be done in what's called decarboxylation, which is where we heat up the plant material. And what it does when we heat it up is it turns that inactive form, THCA, into Delta-9, the active form. Now this is very important because the state of Illinois, when looking at your certificate of analysis, is only focused on the Delta-9 THCA, or sorry, the Delta-9 THC. But the federal rules require that we look at total THC, which takes into consideration the Delta-9 that was in the plant when we took it out of the field, and also the Delta-9 that was in the plant after that decarboxylation step. And if this is a little confusing, I'm hoping this might help clear it up a little bit. So if you look at the certificate of analysis on the left, and we look at that Delta-9, we can see that it is ND, non-detectable, okay? Which would pass the Illinois state rules. And the total THC is under 0.3% as well, which means it would pass the federal rules and regulations. However, this is where it gets a little tricky. Look at the certificate of analysis on the right. We have a Delta-9 THC that is ND, non-detectable, which would pass the state of Illinois rules. However, after decarboxylation, the total THC of that product is 0.628, which is above the 0.3% total THC for the federal rules. So this particular product would be considered hemp in the state of Illinois, but would be considered marijuana in every other state following the federal rules and regulations. This is where following interstate commerce is going to be extremely important in making sure that you are following the appropriate rules and regulations for the state you are traveling into. I'll say this again, this particular certificate of analysis would show that we would have hemp in the state of Illinois, but it would be considered marijuana in any other place in the country. To illustrate how this is working currently, this is a sample of some data points from the Wisconsin, who follows the total THC laws as opposed to Illinois, which follows Delta-9. And towards the last 3 weeks in the growing season from this particular laboratory, all of those data points above that red line would have tested above 0.3% total THC and would have been considered non-compliant. The interesting thing is that most of these would have been considered hemp in the state of Illinois based on our rules and regulations. So this is going to be very important to understand the differences between which state you are in and the rules they are following with regards to total THC and Delta-9 THC. One last thing I'd like to say about this is that the state of Illinois will be following the Delta-9 rules for the 2020 growing season. For one more year, we will follow Delta-9 rules, at which point we will then be looking at total THC after the 2020 growing season. Here's that THC tool, which is available at the University of Wisconsin. It's a great tool. I encourage you to look at it when making, if you would like to have some basic information on variety selection. One last thing about the certificates of analysis before I move on to resources available. I'd like to point out this particular plant here. It has a Delta-9 THC of 0.389, which while that would fail the state rules of Illinois, I'd like to have you look at the total THC, which skyrockets from very low to 11.863% total THC, which is actually substantially strong marijuana. And so the products that are being circulated right now, if you are a consumer, I would like to encourage you to make sure you are looking at both the Delta-9 and the total THC values before ingesting these products. This is just kind of a public service announcement that there has been some cases of folks unintentionally being intoxicated by the products they are consuming. And you can imagine the problems associated with that. So be aware, if you are a consumer, that the products you are taking also have low amounts of total THC and not just low amounts of Delta-9. So resources available to you, I would encourage you to take a look at our website, Google University of Illinois hemp, or just go.illinois.edu/hemp. You will find links to production resources, seed sources in the state of Illinois, varieties that might be of interest to you. We have a buyer-seller network that's available at our website, and we are currently have some variety trials for grain, fiber, and CBD all coming in 2020, which we're really excited about. However, I'd like to point out, if you could please take a look at our needs-based assessment, which is available on our website. It'll take a few minutes to fill out, and it gives us really good important information on what our stakeholders want to learn, where we can do better from our educational programming perspective, and also what research trials and information you would really like us to look into in the future. So this is an opportunity for you to give your feedback to us. As always, my information at the bottom there, please contact me anytime if you have any questions, and I will do my best to assist you. If I don't know the answer, I will find it for you. CBD Market Prices, there's a great resource available, Hemp Benchmarks. They do reports every month giving baseline information on a variety of inputs, costs for biomass, costs for seeds, clones, etc., which may be very useful to you if you are looking to establish a budget and put together some prospective numbers. So in summary, I'd like to say that there are currently no grain and fiber markets in Illinois. CBD production is going to be more labor intensive than many other crops, and field selection is going to be very important. We are looking for well-drained soils that are highly productive with low weed pressure. Think of ways that promote rapid emergence and seedling growth. This is a plant that needs to be kind of babied as it's growing at the beginning, and so we really have to nurse it early on. So good fertility, have a good seed bed, and weed control strategies available is going to be very important for a successful crop. What is the end product? Are you selling this for smokable flower or biomass for processing? Make sure you know where you want to go with the product before you plant it, not just for a end use perspective, but also from a production practice perspective on how you are going to plant and harvest this crop. And lastly, consider post-harvest strategies such as drying, storage, and especially extraction. I would encourage you all to have a conversation or a contract in place prior to growing industrial hemp, as that is where this bottleneck we've seen in the market kind of has developed. And also understanding the tremendous amount of space requirements and potentially additional inputs to get this material down from in the field into your sheds and dried down to the appropriate moisture for storage. prior to extraction. So thank you. Please see the QR code here for the survey and evaluation of the program. It's really important for us to know how we're doing and how we can better serve you. So please take a look at that QR code, scan it with your phone, give us your opinions and your thoughts, and we would really appreciate it. But thank you so much for your time, and I would really take some time for some questions now if we have them.
Sure. Thank you, Phil. One of the first questions that came in, was about pollination, and Jerry has now asked a follow-up question. And, are honeybees attracted to these plants for nectar or any type of pollen, or do they just kind of bypass them?
So they were going for, we had things like Japanese beetles, we had some other pollinators in our grain plots for the male pollen, but we didn't see them so much in our CBD plots where they were the females, which I thought was quite interesting. So it was particularly of interest in our grain and fiber plots they were attracted to the male plants over the females in that regard. But we didn't see, in my experience at least, too much activity in the all CBD or female CBD plots.
Morgan asked, are there growing methods that help to ensure the delta-9 THC stays below the 0.3%?
The best information we have is limiting stress. So in situations where you are able to avoid drought stress or excessive moisture stress, fertility issues, plant damage, mechanical damage, those are the areas where a lot of the literature has suggested that environmental stresses are one of the triggers for THC accumulation. But we're also, really interested in looking at fertility and what excessive fertilization rates do. We look to, the marijuana industry, and we have to be very careful not to follow their regimens because their goals are to maximize THC production, whereas we're trying to limit it in the CBD production. So fertility is an area of interest, but primarily environmental conditions are going to be very important. If you can limit stress, whether that's through drip line irrigation or raised beds to prevent soil saturation, those are really what you're going to want to look for to limit those stresses.
And kind of a follow-up connection with that, Lori asked, are the THC levels generally based on variety differences or growing conditions or what? What do we know so far?
Definitely both, certainly both. And, what's really kind of interesting is that hidden THCA, which gets converted into total THC. So why I think that's so important is that this year in the state of Illinois, we were more focused on that Delta-9 production, but now we have an opportunity. We have one more year really to kind of find out which varieties will pass those more stringent total THC rules. And so this year, I'm thinking plan like it's 2021 and you are growing under the more stringent rules so you can find more stable varieties. But that's kind of where we're at, where we don't know which varieties are going to perform the best. But certainly across varieties and then across environmental conditions, we're going to see differences in THC production. We saw that across the state this year, and then we saw it a lot with the data out of Wisconsin. I'd encourage you to take a look at that tool that was there. You can look at which varieties, and you can see just based off of location and sampling date, how that might have impacted those values.
Do the locations where the hemp is planted need to be zoned agricultural?
Tax I-80 as a farm. So that is the I-80 code, farm code that you need to have to be approved. Correct.
Okay. Let's see. How do I know if my land can, my location can grow? Toledo, I don't know what your question is there. How do I know if my land can, Judith asked, if the male plant seed heads were just cut off, would the plant be stressed enough to change sex?
So the question is asking if the male pollen sacs were removed, if it would change sex?
Yes.
That's a great question. I don't believe so, but to the best of my knowledge, no.
Sue asked, does the crop have a strong smell? I can say it does.
It does. Even a grain plot will still smell more than you would probably think that it would. So absolutely.
Okay. Any regulations concerning the smell then?
No.
Okay, not at this time. Time for maybe one or two more questions. I know Phil has to go to another meeting.
If we got a few, I pushed it. I sent an email out, so we can go.
How many state certified labs for 2020? Do we know that yet?
As far as to the best of my knowledge, no more updates. Still only the 4. However, you can send in samples to other states for your own edification. They are just not considered official laboratory results from the Department of Agriculture. So there are some in Wisconsin, there are some in Kentucky that you can send them to as well if you're just trying to get some information throughout the course of the growing season. Yeah.
Lori asked, any local restrictions over growing hemp? I guess what she's trying to say, have you heard of any local restrictions that are over and above the IDOA regulations for growing hemp?
I'm sorry, I suppose I'm a little confused by the question.
Yeah, are there any cities, townships restricting the growing of hemp in their areas, or is it just ILDA that has the final say on this?
So I have not heard of any other disputes like that, especially now that it's federally legal, and there should be no in the federal rules. There should be no ability to stop the production of them in that regard. It is because it's federally legal, but I have not heard of any cases like that across the state.
So you haven't run into like any city or zoning issues?
No, not at this time, no.
What's the best way to ship the product for testing?
I would contact the laboratories, and they're each going to have their own protocol on how they would like their material shipped to you. So I would reach out to the laboratories, go on their websites. They're going to have that information available there.
Okay. And kind of our final question to wrap up today: any wildlife implications that have been noted with growing this crop?
So some cases of at the early stages of the season, some wild animals going through, things like deer, and taking a nibble of the plants, but then also leaving them alone shortly after. So not so much of like eating of the crop or anything like that. I will say that for the grain hemp, there was a tremendous interest from the birds in the area in the grain hemp fields. So not so much for CBD. It didn't seem that animals were much of an issue. But certainly some interesting interactions with the birds in our grain fields.
Well, thank you, Phil. Thanks for presenting today and really sharing your expertise. If folks have additional questions, they can certainly reach out and contact you about this crop. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar. I hope you get a lot of information that will help you in your small farm endeavors. Hopefully even something you can put in place yet this winter. Please look for an email from Zach, the link to the archived webinar on the Illinois Local Foods YouTube channel, as well as a very short evaluation of the webinar you have just watched. We do look at your feedback and we use it to shape our future webinars. With that, I wish you a fabulous rest of your day and a productive growing season in